Today's New Testament reading comes again from the book of Matthew. We're still plugging our way through Holy Week. The reading is Matthew 22. We're going to be starting with verse 34. And I thought it appropriate. We hear a lot in the scriptures, especially during Holy Week, about those bad guys. Those bad guys called the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So I thought I'd give you a little background about them. They were two different Jewish sects. And we think of them as only the leaders. But it was actually, think of it a little bit like the Protestants and the Catholics. They had different beliefs, and if you were a Jew, there was actually three sects, but the primary ones were the two. The Sadducees were mostly the aristocrats, the upper echelon, the elite, the rulers. Those are the ones that mostly made up the Sadducees. The Pharisees were made up mostly of the common people. The Sadducees, the religious leaders, typically were born into it. It was an inherited thing. The Pharisees, they got to be a religious leader among the Pharisees by having extensive knowledge through a lot of learning. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. The Pharisees did. The Sadducees only accepted the parts of the Torah that were written down. They did not accept any oral tradition. The Pharisees accepted both. And the Pharisees' main focus was on the law. And that's why we hear a little more about them, and because of their focus on the law and especially purity. The Sadducees did not believe in spirits or angels. The Pharisees did. So knowing that, there was a bit of contention between the two sects. Like most humans, each thought they were right. However, when it came to Jesus, they came together for a common goal. They both felt threatened by Jesus, and Jesus basically told both of them, you kind of got it wrong. You both need to change a bit. So today we hear once again Jesus explaining the scripture right before our current. He's just talking to the Sadducees about their belief that there is no resurrection, and he corrects them on that. What I'm going to begin to read, he's addressing the Pharisees, once again about their strictness and adherence to the law. So starting with verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Then, surrounded by the Pharisees, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? They replied, he is the son of David. Jesus responded, then why does David, speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit, call the Messiah my Lord? For David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies beneath your feet. Since David called the Messiah my Lord, how can the Messiah be his son? No one could answer him, and after that, No one dared ask him any more questions. The word of God.
So have you ever read a novel, a long novel, got to know the characters in the novel so well that when the novel ended, you just kind of felt a sense of loss? Like, well, no, I won't be able to spend tomorrow with that character. We've just spent the last 10 or so weeks with Moses. And today we're going to close out the story of Moses by reading about the death of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy repeats a lot of what we read in Exodus, but this particular story, the death of Moses, is a little longer in the book of Deuteronomy. So let's read from Deuteronomy chapter 34. Then Moses went up to Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab and climbed Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead as far as Dan, all the land of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah extending to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the Jordan Valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zor. Then the Lord said to Moses, This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have now allowed you to see it with your own eyes, but you will not enter the land. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, just as the Lord had said. The Lord buried him in a valley near Beth Peor in Moab. But to this day, no one knows the exact place. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyesight was clear and he was as strong as ever. The people of Israel mourned for Moses on the plains of Moab for 30 days, until the customary period of mourning was over. This is the end of the story of Moses. Some considered Moses a prophet. So here was Moses' last days. And God gave him a vision. God said, look, Moses, this is what I promised you. And sure enough, God had promised Moses all of these lands, the promised land, the land of milk and honey. For the past 40 plus years, this land had been the sole focus of Moses. Every decision he made, from the burning bush experience, to going back to the courts of Egypt, to seeing through the plagues, the Exodus, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, the discontent of the people, the golden calf, everything Moses did for that 40 plus years was based on the vision that God had cast before him of the promised land. There he is on the top of the mountain, looking out at the land that God had promised Moses' ancestors, Abraham, Jacob, Israel, Moses, and all their descendants. God had cast a vision for Moses, and he was now seeing the fulfillment of that vision, but without being able to enter into it. We kind of know what that's like in a way, if we really think about it. Owen Slade Murphy, born on Friday. Who amongst us would not hear the words at the birth of a child and not wonder just a little bit, what kind of a world will Owen Slade inherit? What is our role in determining that world that Owen will inherit? Those of us who have had the privilege and honor of having our own children, our own grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who of us have not held that infant and wondered just what the future holds for that little tiny baby? Within each of us, somehow, as we look at the newborn infant, Our sense of time changes. Our emotions change. Everything is different for us. Because we too have been given a vision of the future. This little infant is a vision of the future. And again, the question for us is, what kind of a future will that infant inherit? We are the ones that will provide the foundation for that infant's future. Here we are today in a global crisis, a tiny, tiny little virus. And friends, if we think this is the last time that's going to happen, we have another thing coming. This is the beginning of many of these things. We need to learn how to deal with these viruses in a different way. This is part of the future that the infants born today will be facing. But we can change that, can we not? How about the extreme tribalism that we're dealing with today? The parochialism, our inability to care for others because we are the most important thing on earth. Is this really the kind of future we want our children to inherit? Is this really the future we want our grandchildren to see? We can change the course if we turn to God. We have become such a short-sighted people, looking only after our immediate needs, unable to see a future beyond today, tomorrow, next week, or even next year. Several decades ago, Rachel Carson wrote a book, Silent Spring. And in that book, she sounded the alarm that fortunately we paid attention to. DDT was destroying wildlife, particularly birds. We paid attention. It took a while, but we paid attention. Do you know that since 1970, between 1970 and today, almost 40% of bird life has been destroyed in North America? I used to wake up in the morning and hear the robins singing in the trees and the other birds. Think about it. When's the last time you woke up to a cacophony of bird songs? The warning has been sounded. We need to begin to pay attention. God has given us stewardship over all of creation. And all we're interested in is today, tomorrow, and the next day. The birth of an infant is a sign of God's hope. Martin Luther wrote something. He said, "If I knew the world were ending tomorrow, I would plant an apple tree today." Are we going to plant apple trees? Or are we going to wring our hands and mourn in our anxieties? Are we going to pay attention to the future that God has set before us? Or are we going to ignore what's in front of us? We can provide a different future for our children and grandchildren, friends. That's what we are called to do. How can we ignore? How can we ignore today at the expense of our futures? If a Pharisee stood before you today and said, "What do you think is the most important commandment?" What is your priority? What would you say? What is your most important priority today? I told our men's Bible study a couple weeks ago, my greatest fear is that when I stand before my Creator will say, "Open your checkbook register, Cerny. Show me how you use the resources I gave you. Show me your calendar, Cerny. How did you use your time? The time I gave you." What are your priorities? Of course, Jesus gave the perfect answer. Love your God with everything you have. And to show that God that you truly love that God, love your neighbor as yourself. No exceptions. You see, what we do today, how we treat one another, even those who are disagreeable, is determined by our priorities. You question, how can I love God? The answer is, love your neighbor. Well, how can I love my neighbor? The answer is, love your God. Repeat. Do it over again. It starts with loving your God. How do I show that I love my God? By loving my neighbor. In the book of Luke, this passage is followed by the story of the Good Samaritan. Who are the Samaritans in your life? Who are those that you would just rather not deal with? Who are those who, when you think about, bring some fear in your heart, maybe even some anger? That's not allowed. It's not allowed in your striving to love God first. Because our whole being should be filled with the love of God. Not this wishy-washy kind of love that we pretend is real love. Not the commercial where someone drapes themselves over a car and says, "I love this car." That's not divine love. Divine love is different. Divine love is a love that makes you put your whole being into someone else. God has casted a vision of the promised land for us through Jesus Christ. We need to pay attention. John Lewis wrote a letter before his death that was published on the day of his funeral. And in that letter, he challenged what he called the next generation. He said, I'm asking this next generation to step up and step in, to rid ourselves of this world of hate, to overcome that burden of hate, so that there will be no more violence, so that there will be no more war, so that there will be a world of peace. You see, John Lewis was paying attention. And if you know anything about John Lewis's history, you know, the world didn't give him much reason for hope. He was born into a culture that hated blacks, wanted to do whatever they could to prevent him from succeeding. And in spite of that, he lived a life of faith and hope and inspiration for all of us. Martin Luther King wrote these words as he looked at the vision that God had casted for him. It doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. Listen to this, I just want to do God's will. And God has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I have seen the vision of the promised land. We've been given a vision of the promised land. Owen deserves that promised land. And it's up to us. It's up to us. Those who call themselves disciples of Jesus Christ. It's up to us. We're going to share in a moment words of Negro spiritual, there is a balm in Gilead. David's going to share with us. But I want to tell you a story. Because, in a way, I want you to know my personal journey here. I grew up in a family where my father was a bigot. And I still have residuals of that bigotry in me. When I was in college, I was a tutor for the athletic department at the University of Wisconsin. And I was actually the assistant to the fellow who was in charge of that program. And mid-semester, we would go through the names of the athletes who were in academic difficulty. And he'd say, yeah, I'm not surprised, I'm not surprised, I'm not surprised. And I said, well, John, we have to do something. No, we'll wait until the end of the semester. And then we would invest money into tutors and try to get these kids through their courses. I sat down with two young, strong, big black boys from Texas, trying to get them through their coursework. At one time, they broke down in tears. And I didn't know what Jim Crow was at the time. But Jim Crow was the attempt after the Civil War, where we in the United States created a system of separate but equalness. these two young men sobbed in front of me. And they told me how they knew they were being used by the university to bring attention to the football program, but beyond that, the university had absolutely no interest in them. And then they told me this story. They said they grew up and went to a high school, a black high school in Texas, and right across the street was a white high school. They said they grew up with no textbooks, teachers who weren't well trained, but right across the street they had every resource they needed. What kind of a future are we handing off to our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, friends? We have been up to the mountaintop. Jesus has created a vision for us. And it's up to us. It's up to us. Amen.